2026 sees me travel the length and breadth of England to run a marathon per week in each of its 39 historic counties. Why? To raise funds for Tommy's, the charity that does incredible work to try to end the heartbreak of baby loss. I'll be joined each week by someone who has their own story of loss, their own rollercoaster journey, their own reason to be there. This podcast shares those stories in the hope that they can bring awareness to an often undiscussed topic and even, perhaps, a flicker of light in someone's darkness. You can follow the runs, the stories, and donate to the cause at marathonsformiracles.com. Enjoy. Have a big one this week because we're going to London. It's the London Marathon on Sunday. Brighton a couple of weeks ago felt like a bit of a warm up, I think. And having gone back to Nottinghamshire at the weekend and run through fields again with no one around, it's going to be quite the contrast. So pleased to have had that little warm up in Brighton a couple of weeks ago. And a nice week for me because I'm running with my mate Charlie. Charlie, I've known for years. He's my best friend. He was my best man, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather be running the London Marathon with. He might disagree, but I'll let him comment on that a bit later on.
I think it's safe to say you've chosen me to run with you not because of my running ability, but rather because of the friendship. But I'll do what I can.
So yeah, an exciting one. But as ever, Charlie and his wife Alice and family have a reason to be running for Tommy's and for fundraising, which we're going to talk more about today. And I've sort of alluded to it a few times in previous weeks that we are going to be doing an episode that's a bit more focused on IVF and the IVF process. Spoiler alert. That's today. So we will kick off in our usual fashion. And Charlie, what is it, other than the fact that I asked you and you couldn't really say no, what is it that led you and Alice to be involved with Marathons for Miracles and with Tommy's and their
kids to yourself and also those that may have gone through it or may currently be going through it. So it's just important, I think, to start with that. But then looking at our actual story, going right back to the beginning, quite early on in my relationship with my now wife, Alice, you always knew we wanted to have children. That came clear very early on. Alice had always sort of struggled with some period-related issues. We'd had some NHS investigations into those. Never really got to the bottom of it. But what that meant is that we knew that things were unlikely to be straightforward for us. And so that was always something that has played on our mind over the last sort of years of our relationship. But actually, after a reasonably short period of time trying to conceive, Alice fell pregnant with our first daughter, Dorothy, your goddaughter, who was born in 2021. So actually, the start of the story, incredibly positive, cannot complain at all. And this whole subject was just completely alien to us, as it is for so many people, which is part of what we're trying to change. So then fast forward 2 years after Dorothy was born, because we had it in our head that a 3-year age gap is what you should be aiming for, which we now, of course, realize is such an incredibly privileged thing to even think about. And for what it's worth, it's just complete nonsense. Age gaps just do not matter. But anyway, it was important to us at the time. I started trying to conceive, and nothing happened for a year, 18 months, which, the common part of most people's stories, even people that have then gone on to have no issues. But Alice still had some issues, sort of period-related issues. And so we restarted medical investigations into those. And this is one of the areas in which we're incredibly lucky. Alice had private medical insurance through work, and it covered those investigations. So it covered those investigations whilst they were addressing an underlying medical issue. They didn't cover fertility. And there's a bit of a blurred line as to when one stops and the other one started. But it covered those investigations. So that included a there's going to be quite a medical quite a lot of medical stuff in this story, so you have to bear with me a bit and let me know if I get any of it wrong. But that's essentially an investigation into the wound to see if there are any underlying issues there. And then we had various tests. And the benefit of a lot of those tests is that they are the same tests that you need to run prior to commencing fertility treatment. So we're able to get quite a lot of that stuff through Alice's insurance, which was quite quite important in terms of financial side, which we'll go on to. But the problem with all of that is that it never really got to the bottom of what the issue was. And I think one thing I've learned is just how little research there is into the causes of various women's health issues, but particularly fertility. The advice was that it was either probably some sort of hormone imbalance. And the options are either go on a contraceptive to just stop the issue. Now, that obviously isn't very helpful if you're trying to have children, or to start and move from this investigating an underlying health issue to going down an infertility pathway, which I've sort of trailed already, wasn't covered by insurance. And I don't think we ever really sat down and discussed what the plan was. Those investigations just sort of evolved from trying to get to the bottom of these medical issues. So suddenly we're at a fertility clinic, and it helped by the fact that the same doctor carried out the investigations, which also our fertility doctor, and was also actually there on the day, sorry, spoiler alert, on the day that our second child was actually born. So he sort of actually turned out to be quite an important man that took us through this journey, and was an absolute legend. And also we didn't really give it any thought then, and I'd never given this any sort of thought before then either. I had such a limited understanding of infertility. And I just thought, as I suspect quite a lot of young blokes do, and maybe a lot of young women do as well, I just thought, if you can't have children naturally, then you just go and have IVF, and yeah, it's a bit expensive, but you just go and do it, and that's it, and you have a baby. And that's just another instance of sort of the privilege or the naivety that I had, because I just didn't have a clue. So we go on to fertility treatment, and this is where I think it's probably quite important for a caveat that I'm not a doctor and I don't have a particularly scientific brain. So please just bear in mind that what I'm saying might not be right. And of course, the fertility treatment is such a personal thing, and the drugs have different impacts on different people. But our journey started with...
We have a disclaimer on the podcast notes.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
We don't know what we're talking about.
I love a disclaimer. I'm happy with that. So we started with a round of Clomid, which is a really common fertility drug that induces ovulation. So it increases stimulates follicle growth. Follicles so often contain eggs, and therefore more eggs increases the likelihood of fertilization. Fertilization occurs in the normal way, with most of the mechanical or artificial fertilization, and it's a really common starting point. It's relatively cheap. I say relatively because cost of IVF, as a lot of people know, can get quite eye-watering. But I think the drugs were less than £50 for a round, and then you've got some consultation fees on top of that. So you're talking low hundreds of pounds per round, which is not an insignificant amount, but in the grand scheme of IVF, pretty cheap. Clomid for us was a pretty horrible drug. I said for us, sorry. Clomid for Alice is a particularly horrible drug. It's got some really nasty side effects, both physical and psychological. And I was speaking to Alice yesterday about it, and her memory of it is this was actually the one she found the most difficult psychologically. It's a hormone treatment. It does all sorts of funny things to your body and your brain. We did 2 rounds of that, and no luck. So we started.
So the aim of the Clomid is to try and kickstart your fertility naturally without needing to then have IVF.
Correct. The idea is to just increase the amount of eggs that you release, which just naturally increases the chances of fertilization happening. So you're trying to get your timing right with when you have sex, but other than the use of those drugs, everything else sort of occurs in the normal way. I know people don't always like the word normal for this.
Yeah,
hopefully that explains it. But then we started the 3rd round. And we were just about to go on holiday. We thought we needed a holiday. This has all been a bit grim. So we went off to Crete for a week. And on the way to the airport, Alice wasn't feeling very well. But nothing that particularly concerned us. She just didn't feel very good. We then got to the hotel, and Alice basically collapsed in the hotel lobby. And we ended up being blue lighted to a hospital. And this is when I found out. Alice already knew because Alice had done the research properly. I was just winging it at this stage because it didn't really involve me. But there is a known but very rare side effect of most fertility drugs, Clomid being one, called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And it happens in IVF. It happens more often when you're on higher doses of ovulation stimulation drugs. It is quite rare in Clomid or low doses of Clomid that we're on, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And it happened to us, or we suspect it happened to us, and it causes fluid buildup in your ovaries. And it can actually be really quite dangerous. Although in this country, if it happens, doctors know about it and they can get on top of it. But the issue that we have is that we couldn't just pop down to our fertility clinic that knew us. We were in the middle of Crete in a foreign hospital in the middle of the night. They didn't speak much English and we didn't speak any Greek. And the hospital was also still in a bit of a COVID mode. So I wasn't allowed on the ward. We had Dorothy with us as well, which none of it was definite, but that was particularly unpleasant. And I think that was probably one of the most stressful parts of the whole thing. Of course, even much worse for Alice, who was going through the physical side of it, and extremely painful, incredibly stressful. The doctors didn't know what was going on, trying to explain to a doctor that only speaks Greek, but we think she's got AHSS. And we just really struggled to explain what was going on. Thankfully, it sort of just sorted itself out. I say that flippantly, and I don't mean it. It was sort of 10 or 12 hours of sort of incredible pain for Alice. But in the morning, she managed to get back to the hotel, and we sort of didn't quite have the week we'd managed, but managed to salvage some sort of holiday from it. And Alice was thankfully came out of it reasonably unscathed. But for me, that was when the whole process suddenly became so real. We weren't Alice wasn't just taking drugs to have a baby, but there was actually a sacrifice that Alice was making physically for this.
When was that holiday, Charlie?
So that was all in March 2024. So we started the treatment a couple of months before that, and that was the third round. So then we got back to the UK, fertility clinic, incredibly surprised, almost didn't believe us because it's quite rare in the drugs that we were on. But what that meant was that they cancelled the next cycle of Clomid and said, right, this clearly isn't working. And we moved on to a different pathway because we needed to keep saying it's obviously very much Alice going through the process. But what Alice needed was more monitoring as well as a different drug that we don't have that reaction to. So then we moved on to a drug called letrozole, which is also a common fertility treatment drug. It works very similarly to Clomid, increases ovulation, increases the likelihood of fertilization. But where that was different is that we had periodic scans. I think they were every sort of 3 or 4 days during the stimulation cycle to check follicle growth. And in particular, they're looking for how well your positive reaction to it, so making sure that you are producing more follicles, and also, particularly in our case, making sure that you're not producing too many, which is a warning sign for HSS. It's more expensive. So from memory, I think the drugs were a bit more expensive. I think the drugs were now in the sort of £100, £200 mark. But then you're also paying for the monitoring. So you're paying for more consultations, and then each of these scans that you're having. Similar side effects to Clomid, not very nice at all, but not from memory again. I don't think Alice found it as bad as the Clomid, but it's hugely personal how you react to these drugs. We had one round of that, which failed, but it was the monitoring that came along that showed that there was clearly something else that was going wrong. This wasn't just bad luck. We had no issues with ovulation. Ovulation was happening absolutely fine. Loads of follicles, loads of eggs, all going well, that's something that a lot of people struggle with. We didn't have that problem. There's some sort of hormonal imbalance that was just messing up the timing of fertilization, and just it was just a Venn diagram that wasn't meeting in the middle. And that's coupled with the fact that I obviously had my sperm tested. So like the results came back and the doctor just said, "Oh yeah, your results are absolutely fine." When we then looked at the results with the consultant, he was like, "Well, they're fine, but they're not great." And so there you've got this situation where you've got some hormone imbalance on Alice's side. My swimmers aren't doing a particularly great job. And so this, yeah, as I said, this Venn diagram where the sort of bit where they're touching is just either tiny or non-existent. I think it just made us realise as well just how lucky we were with Dotto. Maybe this is a problem that developed since then. The stars just aligned whenever it was.
Literally, literally just written that down. And it's just you're going through now a sort of 2-3 year process of trying to have a second, which others might be going through or could have gone through. People may have exactly the same issues that you had and could have 2 kids just completely by that one in a million or whatever getting through, but equally could never have had either of your children and have gone through this whole process. And
Yeah.
just
And
written it down and put a big circle around it, because I think it's indicative of so much that we talk about, it being a bit of a game of chance, really.
yeah, and in so many ways we are incredibly lucky, having Dottie relatively easy. The overall outcome is incredibly lucky. Obviously, but also there are elements of the story where the luck hasn't been on our side, and it's difficult to form a view looking back at it retrospectively, because at the time it was a horrendously negative experience. But ultimately with a positive outcome. Yeah, so where were we? We'd realised that there was an issue here. We realised that the odds were massively stacked against us, and we were just throwing good money after bad, sort of continuing with this sort of drug and monitoring approach. Also, I'd never really had a proper discussion about IVF. I think we'd always just assumed that we weren't going to need it, because every time we'd had tests done, they'd come back either on her or me, they'd come back in the normal range, and just thought, okay, we'll need a bit of assistance from some drugs, and that'll be that, and we'll be happy. But it's funny how the train just sort of keeps on rolling. And this is a theme from quite a few of your previous podcasts as well, of how things just sort of carry on going and develop, and sort of investigation snowball, and suddenly you end up in a completely different place to where you expected you to be. And on IVF, or just fertility treatment more generally, Alice and I had really conflicting views, not between the two of us, but within our own minds, and the sort of same issues that we were having. We both really, really wanted to have a second child. We wanted Dottie to be a big sister. We'd always pictured ourselves as one for. All of our mates had two or more children, and all of those reasons I know, especially to some of your listeners that are in the thick of this, could seem really, really trivial, but it was pretty real for us at the time. And so you're battling with that. What we're struggling with is what's called secondary infertility. So if it's your primary infertility is when you're struggling to have your first child. Secondary is for any after that. And I would say with secondary infertility, it's a really lonely place, because it's the same loneliness that everyone who's taken part in this podcast is dealing with. But all of these are really difficult to talk to with people that haven't gone through it. But also, you're acutely aware of the privilege of the fact that you've already got one child, and that adds a certain element of guilt to the process. All irrational, but it doesn't mean you don't feel it. And that guilt, you're worried, well, one child should be enough. Of course, having one child is enough. There is no right or wrong number of children to have. But you're trying to look after Dottie whilst having treatment, whilst juggling work. And just trying to have a chat with people that are either gone through none of it, who just try their best but don't get it. And then there's also certain people that you just can't have. We can't complain about our situation to someone that's struggling with primary infertility, for example. It's just not. that wouldn't be fair. None of this is rational, but all of this stuff is just rational through your head at a million miles an hour when you're in the thick of it. I was particularly worried about the physical impact on Alice. Um, you touched on this a second ago. I've spent 15 minutes talking about the process so far. This is this is a period of several years by this point. Every time doing a pregnancy test, getting a negative result, struggling with that. Right, okay, cool. Let's start again. Another round of drugs. Seeing the impact that that's having psychologically, physically on Alice, and then by extension me. But in the end, and it almost feels ridiculous saying it, but it was easier to carry on the treatment than it was to stop. And I think especially having listened to some of your previous podcasts, that decision to stop must be one of the most difficult decisions that you can make, because I think it's so much easier to keep the train on the tracks and just keep trying than it is to admit to yourself that maybe it's time to stop. And I remember being absolutely terrified of having to think about the day when that decision might come, and just hoping that we never had to make it. And another run, we're really grateful we never did have to make that decision. But yeah, so IVF, we did it. We carried on with that, and IVF itself is in some ways quite a complicated process, and in some ways quite straightforward. We did what was known as a long down protocol. Alice takes the pill for a month, just stop the cycle, stop everything, and then you restart it in a controlled manner. And what IVF does is it turns the computer off again and turns it back on, and controls every single aspect of how Alice's reproductive system hopefully gets pregnant. The drugs are really unpleasant, similar to the clomid and the letrozole that Alice had been on, but it's just the intensity of it. And yeah, again, more of the same physical, psychological side effects, coupled with the stress and the guilt of the situation, the fact that you are going off to the clinic every couple of days. And we're really lucky, our clinic is about 20 minutes away. A couple of weeks ago, you were speaking to a woman whose clinic was like 2-3 hours away. Like, I hadn't even considered that as an issue. You're there all the time. You'd become like great friends with the receptionist. Like it's yeah, it feels like a second home. And of course, Alice having to inject herself twice a day for the most part. For some reason, she didn't trust me to do it. Apparently, I did a very lousy job of doing some injections for her when Dottie was born, so I wasn't called up for that. But yeah, so that's step one. So turning everything off, and then you start it up again. So step two is stimulation, ovarian stimulation, similar to what Alice had already been doing. Daily injections, sometimes once, sometimes twice a day, encouraging follicle growth. And then you are scanned and poked every 2 or 3 days, monitoring for a period of about 2 weeks to see how your ovaries are responding to it. You then have what's known as a trigger shot, which is what tells your eggs to mature and get ready for collection. And that's a really important step, because what you don't want is the eggs releasing on their own. You need to get them right the way up until they're ready and then collect them. So it's about getting that timing perfect. And I think they even tell you what time to take it. So say at 4 o'clock on Thursday, I think 24 hours before collection, you take that shot and then you hop in, and you're collected at exactly the right time. So you then have a collection. So that's an operation under sedation. So you're not sort of full general, but still sort of fairly heavy. Yeah, yeah. The eggs are collected by the big long needle, and then the sperm is collected on the same day as that. On that day, fertilization takes place. So the embryologist takes it away, mixes it all together. And on that day, you're told how many eggs that they've collected. The next day, you're told how many have successfully fertilized. And then on day 4, you're told, and this is the sort of the real nervous bit, assuming everything's gone well so far, you're told how many of those embryos have survived, and then they're each given a grading. I can't remember the grading system today, but to tell you how, whether they're any good or not. And it's to do with how they multiply. But the ideal is you're looking for them to got to what's called the blastocyst stage, which is basically the perfect stage for them to be at, ready for implantation. And ideally, you want quite a few of those. One to put back in, and then any spare that you've got you then freeze them. So that if you have to do another cycle of IVF, you don't have to do the stimulation phase. You can just go straight to getting it and running for implantation. And then the final stage of the sort of IVF process itself is implantation or transfer. Some will have a fresh transfer. So that's the egg that you just had collected a few days before. Others, sometimes they'll all go into the freezer and you'll wait a bit, kind of like, hugely personal. We did a fresh transfer and they put one or two of these embryos, hopefully blastocysts, into the room by a catheter. That is not under sedation. So I was in the room for that. Really quite surreal, that one. And then you stay on really heavy progesterone drugs, that's injections, and then also pessaries, which are quite unpleasant in themselves, for several weeks after to maintain. So that's the sort of process. I mean, if you actually want to know what the process actually is, go on the Tommy's website, because I think I've definitely have got that wrong, but it's a sort of brief summary.
It sounds fairly.
So how was IVF for us? Alice, as she had done through this whole process, responded really well to the stimulation drugs. Horrible side effects, which we touched upon, but the follicle stimulation worked really well, and there was no signs of overstimulation. Stimulation, which is good. We retrieved 14 eggs, which is a nice. That's a decent number. Like a number to be really happy with. You know that not all of them are going to fertilize. You know that not all of them are going to survive until day 4, and you know that sets it in a good state to put in the freezer. 11 fertilized. Again, really good. Like that. Most people would be really chuffed with that. And we were on an absolute high at this point, thinking, "God, we've never, that's we're gonna, you know, the odds are so they've been so against us so far that things are finally turning our way." And then you get the phone call on day 3 or 4, and we were told that we had 4, and that they were all very, very poor.
Very.
Yeah, really poorly graded. None of them blastocysts, and it just completely knocked us out. It felt like the whole process has been for nothing. We were going to have to do the whole thing over again. It's just not enough. Not in a good. Like, how have we managed to go from everything going so well to everything going so badly in one? I don't think it was even a phone call. I think we just went on the web portal and found this report on them. But there was still sort of potential for there to be something changed. We have one more day until the transfer. So still time for, you know, hopefully all of them, but some of them to develop further. But we're still booked in. They didn't cancel the transfer. Arrived at the clinic ready for the transfer, told that now we've only got 2, and they're still poor, not blastocysts. I mean, even the embryologist was upset. She was trying to explain how this can happen. And the answer is that no one really knows how it happens. It's all sort of a bit of an unknown. And then the doctor came along and, in their typical sense, managed the expectations, said, best thing you can do is hope for the best, but put 2 in. And I think he said, let's let nature take its course, which is quite a worrying phrase from the doctor. And yeah, I think he gave us a less than 2% chance of this being successful. But he said, you can't put them in the freezer. He said, the best place for them is let's put them in and see what happens. So we cried for about 2 days, bought a cat, didn't want a cat, bought one, just waiting for the horrendous news to come. And one thing people who've been through IVF will always say is just how difficult the waiting period is. Because technically, once they put them back in, you're technically classified as a pregnant person. But we knew, we believed that we weren't. We thought this had failed. I'm generally a very positive person, and I can turn most things into a good story, and not with this one. But then, I think, was it 14 days later? Or yeah, 8, 9, 10, a week and a half later, took a pregnancy test and it came back positive. Obviously didn't believe it. I think we probably spent about £100 on pregnancy tests, and all positive. You then go to the clinic for an 8-week scan, and I think still in our heads at this point, it failed and the test was wrong. And then we had that scan, and there's one healthy baby in there. I got told off for swearing, but yeah, like the most for things to be going after like an unbelievably stressful 2 years, for it to then culminate in everything going well and sort of the hope that comes from that, to then the utter devastation of it in our minds failing, but then it actually, oh, it hasn't failed. I like, we never, it's not something we should complain about at all, because it's an absolutely wonderful, happy ending. But, I don't think we celebrated it until he was actually born. And yeah, now just unbelievably grateful for the whole process. And we realized, just even with IVF, I said at the start, I just assumed that you just take some drugs, you just do IVF and you just have a baby. Once you look into it, you realize that even with IVF, the odds are still really heavily stacked against you. But, yeah, like I said, for us, it's a conflicting one because it was awful at the time, but a great outcome. And now we've got Monty, who's 9 months old, and he's absolutely brilliant, little boy. Yeah, that's 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 what got me here. And then some bloke that was my best man at my wedding said, "Do you want to run a marathon?" And I said, "Yes."
We'll come on to the running later, because that's a whole other challenge in itself for you, particularly, Charlie. But I'm getting a bit emotional listening back to you recounting the story, and it's an interesting one for me because it's probably the first week that we've had where I can add my perspective as well, which I'll also come on to. But I mean, I remember when you called me to tell me that you were pregnant. I was in a pub in Dublin and it was packed and it was really loud. And I was with a load of clients, and I just had to sort of turn around and just have a little cry to myself in the corner. I was,
Well, you didn't respond. You just went silent, and then you were like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm crying." I was like, "Yeah, that's fine, me too."
and yeah, obviously we're so chuffed that Monty's here now, and it's all worked out in the end. But I think, just for me, reflecting on that period of time, and you mentioned your sort of opening line was about how there's so much stigma around these conversations and how difficult they are to have, and how rarely they are had. To put that into context for everyone listening, as we've said a couple of times, like Charlie and I are best mates. We've known each other for nearly 20 years. Like, Amy and I had an inkling that there was something going on, something wasn't quite right. We were worried that maybe it was like marital issues, or that you didn't like us anymore, or something. Um, and we still met up regularly, and we always had a nice time when we did. But I don't know, there was just something for us. When you know people really well, you get a vibe. I remember when Alice went into hospital when you were in Crete, and you sort of said, well, she wasn't very well, and that was obviously a very worrying time. And again, at this point, so that's March 24. We didn't really know what was going on. We wondered if, because obviously by this point Amy and I had had our miscarriage prior to Poppy, so we were sort of wondering, is it something pregnancy related? We knew that you guys probably wanted to have a second, and it had been, yeah, Dottie was now 2, 3, so it was probably getting to that point. So we wondered, but we didn't know. And then I remember we went for Amy and I got married in June 24, and we had a dinner up here in Shrewsbury in April, I think it was. And post lunch and a few beers, we were walking from one pub to the next, and I think I collared you before we went into the next pub. Almost sort of pinned you up against the wall and was like, "Tell me what's going on. I know something's going on. What is it? What can we do to help?" And you told me where you were up to and what it was, and it all suddenly made sense. And Alice going through what she was going through and the effects that the hormones have on her and were having on her at the time, so many things just clicked into place. And if that's the situation between two couples who are like the closest of friends, and the difficulty that comes with talking about these things in that setting, like, how impossible is it then to have that conversation as a wider society? How difficult is it to have those conversations with employers, with people that you need to let know about this stuff in order to carry on living your life? And that struck me at the time. It's like, should, should we have done something to be more open? Or, but I don't think is the case. I think, as you've said, it's a very personal thing. It's a very individual thing, and it's a very difficult time. And it's common enough when that stuff's happening to sort of batten down the hatches and go a bit internal, and we'll get through this. But when it's topics that the world tells you are stuff that people don't really want to know about, on top of that, like it makes it so much more difficult. So, um, as I say, we're obviously delighted that Monty is now here. But as we've said so many times, like the good things are good things and bad things are bad things, and they can coexist, and they can still have their own. They can each have their own effect without necessarily infecting the other side. So it's absolutely, your story will be so familiar to so many people, but so unfamiliar, as you said, to so many more people who just have no concept of what it can and sometimes does take to get from A to B via C, D, E, F, G, H, and I up on the way.
Just on that talking to people point, I think that's where I'm massively pivotal. Because if I've got friends that are going
Really?
through something, I, I will, yeah, as you well know, because you've been on the team on both ends of it. If I've got a mate that's going through something, I will be saying, "Come on, mate, talk to me about it. What's going on? Bring me whenever you need me." Blah blah blah. But it's good. Problem shared is a problem halved. All that stuff. Whereas I don't take my own advice on that. And for me, actually talking to people about it came from necessity. Similar to the sort of the analogy of the train, but at the start we were just having some investigations done. It wasn't really there wasn't an issue that you're aware of. There was nothing really to say. And so I didn't say anything. We then had the Crete situation, and that was like the sort of the moment for me where it suddenly became real. From memory, I think it was shortly after that we then had that chat, which I accept was prompted by you. It wasn't prompted by me, but I was grateful for the prompt and grateful to then speak about it. Work is an interesting one as well. Like I couldn't do the job I do whilst going through IVF without letting them know that one, I basically wasn't going to turn up to the office for a month. Two, that I was going to be in a foul mood most of the time, and that I've had to drop off at various intervals, and I wasn't even the one going through it. All of that stuff that I'm complaining about, and acutely aware of the fact that virality was 10 times worse. But even for me as a supporter in the situation, I had to speak to them. Super uncomfortable. Like my work are incredibly supportive about these sorts of things, but no issues whatsoever about the pastoral care they provide. But I felt super uncomfortable telling them, but I had to. It was from that necessity, and yeah, I will continue to be a hypocrite on that. Like you need to find someone to speak to about it, and I'm very glad that I did. And I had a few other people that spoke to about it throughout the process, and it does take a big weight off your shoulders.
But I think it is so common that it ends up, the first time you end up having the conversation is with your line manager or someone from HR, because you're doing it out of necessity, and therefore it becomes the first time you have that conversation, which is such a strange way of going about it, but it's not. It's so common. And you mentioned Alice that we spoke to, who ran with us and Dorset, who's had cycles of IVF as well, and she's now got an Instagram page called Head Full of Joy, which is focused around how do you navigate a career and fertility treatment specifically. Obviously, there's people talk about how do you navigate career and kids all the time, because that's something that we're allowed to talk about, and people talk about it very openly. The fertility treatments and the miscarriages and the darker side of pregnancy, if you like. That's not my view on it, but I think that's the perception that society has. how do you talk about those things in public? How do you tell your friends about it? How do you tell your boss about it? How do you broach the subject? So Tommy's obviously a fantastic resource, but can recommend Alice's Instagram as well. She's had some viral posts, what should be seemingly simple topics like how to talk to your boss about the fact that you're having IVF treatment, or
Just to echo your shout out of Tommy's, they also provide support to companies to help them with the other side of this and how to manage employees that are going through this sort of stuff. I'm actually in the process at the moment of trying to put them in touch with my employer to try and sort of get that set up because it works both ways. And
yeah,
what you don't really want to have to be doing is telling someone that you're going through this really difficult thing in your life, and then also having to explain to them what it is and and why it's difficult. Because actually, if you haven't been through it or you don't know someone that's close to you that's been through it,
yeah,
it's difficult to comprehend.
yeah. And as you like you say, it becomes not only the first conversation that you have to have, but you end up having to go into gory details about it because, like you say, you need to make the other person understand. Okay, yes, Alice has got an appointment and I want to go with her, but you know, why do you need to be with her? Why do you then need to pick Dottie up from nursery where you perhaps wouldn't do ordinarily? And it's all those. So like I say, it's just so unknown. It's under discussed. So yeah, important from my perspective to have this conversation included in what we're doing, because again, you mentioned luck, and it's probably, I don't think we've missed a week where someone hasn't mentioned luck and how lucky they are. And I think back to the NICU episode that we did with Robert and Annabelle. The fact that Robert and Annabelle now have Jago, who is very healthy and happy, doesn't detract from the 3 months that they spent in NICU, which was an incredibly stressful time. And their recollections of that experience, in the same way that your recollections of IVF will be very valuable to other people who need to go through it. And also, it's nice that not every week we have to have conversations about loss. That's also interesting, and that leads me to my first question. There wasn't a loss for you and Alice, but you have a normal, straightforward pregnancy with Dottie to compare with the pregnancy and experience that you had with Monty. Do you feel that there were elements of loss in terms of the experience that you had with the two? How do they compare, or is there any comparison at all?
I think yes and no, but thankfully we've never lost a pregnancy. I have indirect experience of that through being close friends with you, of course, and but we thankfully haven't gone through that. We've obviously lost other people in our life. This is sort of similar and different in so many ways. And I think with infertility, you are almost mourning something that hasn't happened yet. The debate whether mourning is the right word for that or not. But it's this sort of deep yearning for something that it appears like the whole world is trying to stop you from getting. And you talk about it for half an hour on a podcast. These are long periods of time that you're going through dealing with this. And you've got friends that are sharing the wonderful news that they're pregnant. And you're so happy for them and also desperately sad for yourself. That's a really tricky thing that everyone that's struggling with infertility and baby loss has to deal with. So yeah, in some ways you're sort of going through a bit of a mourning-like process, but there's no end point. And it's this working out, well, how long do we do this for? The money's going to run out at some point. We're physically going to be exhausted after this process. Like when do we stop? And that it's such a difficult stress to explain to someone who hasn't gone through it. But the second you talk to someone that have been through it and you mention that to them, they're like, "Oh my God, yeah, right. How do you consider that?" So yeah, it's a no.
You mentioned the financial side of it. And again, this is unfamiliar territory for me, but purely just based on conversations that we've had. You and Alice have been trying for a year and a half before you started to sort of explore your options for the first time. Was anything offered on the NHS, or was it that you had the medical insurance there, so you started down that route and therefore didn't come back, or what was the scenario of that?
So there's some in Essex. There is, at the time we were going through it, I don't know if things have changed, but there's no NHS support for secondary infertility in Essex. You could take that all day or all long, as you've mentioned on various Google podcasts. There's funding balance, and that's really tricky to get that right. But
Okay, so that my conception of, if you've been trying for 12 months unsuccessfully, you can then look at IVF, is if you don't have any children.
that was certainly the case for us in Essex.
Yeah.
Whether that may well be different in other counties and may have changed in Essex, I don't know. But there was no possibility of an NHS funding for us. So there would have been NHS funding for the initial investigations when it was looking at this as a medical problem to sell to the sort of scientific graphic. But it would have taken ages to have the benefit of this insurance. Health insurance, I think, almost never covers IVF and things like that. Again, there may be examples where it does, but it certainly didn't for us. And so we're always going to have to fund the IVF ourselves. And that does just add a different dimension. It's a horrible calculation to have to make. But I think the whole thing, all told, probably ended up costing us somewhere between £12,000 and £15,000, which is a huge amount of money. And then you're like, but you can't put a price on a baby. Well, turns out you can. It's £15,000 if you get it the first time round.
Yeah.
And so that just adds this whole different and really quite unpleasant dimension to an already unpleasant process. But as I say, the benefits of that are that you don't get sent off.
It's not something you want to turn into like a utilitarian issue, is it? But it becomes that. We're trying to quantify.
Yeah, and it's the best £12,000 we've ever spent in hindsight. But yeah, tricky. Well aware that it's a huge amount of money. And everyone will have that. People who deserve to have children just as much.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking back on the time that you were going through the processes, and particularly Alice going through the hormonal treatment, don't want you to say anything that's going to get you or me into trouble, but how different a person was your wife for that 12 months?
It was so much more acute on the simulation drugs. And I don't think she would hit me for saying this, maybe she will, but she was a completely different person. It just completely wipes you out because it's a hormone drug, and it changes. If you think about how much it can change during pregnancy, times that 5 and back to a 5 or 6. Again, it's different people responding in a different way, but yeah, but I guess the benefit is it's coming, why it's happening, and I guess my job was to support that, and just try and be as helpful and try and be as least annoying as possible. But yeah, it's a huge part of it.
Mm. But that's also, and this is where we're not going to sit here as two blokes and say, "Oh, woe is us." It makes for a very different relationship, a very different set of circumstances, and it's the difficulty of walking that tightrope, should we say, from a male perspective, was not one to be underplayed, I don't think.
No, I mean, going through IVF is the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life, and I was responsible for probably less than 1% of it. Like, all of the burden, physically, psychologically, was taken on by Alice, and it was still the hardest thing that I've ever had to do and process. And so I can't even begin to imagine how difficult it was for her. To your actual point, I mean, you could draw a parallel with other types of loss or struggle, like grief, for example. If you lose someone close in your family, it can make you say and do some slightly strange things. I guess all everyone else can do around that is understand the reason why, understand that it's, that hopefully there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think it's made our marriage stronger, actually, having been through it. In fact, it definitely has made our marriage stronger.
I've said this on a previous podcast that I think I was a guest on, and it was something that Trevor, who you know of, Charlie, had said to me at lunch once. Probably a fairly throwaway comment from him at the time, but has sort of rung true since. Is that um, I think I'd been with Amy for a year or so, and it was going well. And he said, "I'm glad everything's going well. It looks like it's moving in the right direction." He said, "Wait till something bad happens, because then you'll know." And I sort of thought, hmm, okay, it's a bit of a strange thing to say, but now in hindsight, like the way that we as a couple dealt with our miscarriage and the subsequent months just solidified in my brain that she was 100% the right person for me to be with. Because if we could get through that, then we could get through most things. So yeah, that 100% rings true. You spoke yourself about your own misconceptions around IVF and your process, and that's the perfect example of how widely misconceived IVF and a lot of these we discuss are within society as a whole. What's your view on how that could be changed, or how that needs to change, and how that might have helped you in your situation?
So I think what's great is that when you find yourself in this situation, there are lots of really great resources that are only a couple of clicks away. And so you don't have to be on Tommy's website for long to get the general gist of pretty much anything to do with even just regular pregnancy, that process. And so on the one hand, that information is there when you need it. And part of the purpose of this challenge is to make more people aware of just how easy it is to get this information if you need it. I think anything that can be done to increase knowledge more broadly, so making sure that people have an idea about these sorts of things before they need it, is a positive thing. And you know, that's the bread and butter of what Tom's do, and that's exactly what this challenge is about. And just trying to get people talking about it more, which is tricky because it can be a deep difficult to stick that.
Yeah, it's something you mentioned is about trying to get your employer in touch with Tommy's, and it's hadn't really struck me before today, but that's probably the way to do it, isn't it? It's if there's things that are important in the world that people need to know about, we sort of learn about them at school, and you'll inevitably have had a talk or a, what did they used to call it? PSHE or something like that, lesson about it. But once you leave school, that sort of stops. And it's whilst there are lots of resources out there and lots of TV programs on, it's reliant on an individual to decide that they want to consume that information or to watch that TV program. You know, there's the series on at the moment on the BBC, Babies, which I've watched. I haven't finished it yet, but I've watched the first few episodes, and its depiction of miscarriage and loss and the sort of what's going on within a relationship during that time is absolutely superb. I think they've nailed it, certainly what I've seen so far. But I'm watching it because I went through that, and therefore I'm finding it fascinating to see how they portray it. But I said to Amy the other day, like, it's very realistic that someone who hasn't been through miscarriage could watch the first episode of that program and go, God, this is bleak. I'm not going to watch the rest of this. And that's that. Like the potential for people's exposure to it is over. So anyway, long-winded approach to it, but going through companies and organizations taking it upon themselves to present some of these topics to a wider audience is perhaps the way to do it. But then, you know, it takes some company to say, oh, we need to put aside an hour on a Tuesday afternoon for the whole company to come and hear about X.
Yeah, so our firm does quite like that. And it's none of it's mandatory. It's on a variety of topics, but every week there will be something like that. And total range of topics, not all health related. And I think that's a great way of doing it. Obviously, I work for quite a large organisation, so they can put that on themselves. But I'm sure there are resources for smaller companies to collaborate with others.
But as you say, a lot of it goes through the charities, and Tommy's are are one of those, and
Mhm.
these things don't happen for free. So, as ever, if anyone's listening and wants to support that work that Tommy's are doing, as we're trying to do this year, then please visit marathonsformiracles.com and click on the big pink donate now button, and you can help Tommy's to help others in similar situations. So, a final question on this part of the chat, and as you said, what, if any, advice would you offer to others who were perhaps embarking on an IVF journey, or the start of so looking into infertility? What did you learn about yourselves and each other that might help others going through similar times?
Yeah, so what I would say links back to what I said right at the start of answer to the first question, which is just try and as early as possible grapple with this stigma of worrying about whether your problem is big enough to talk to other people about it. Find a small group of people, big group of people, find whatever you can. Make sure you find someone that's not just your partner that you can talk to about it. And the worst that happens is that you speak to someone about it and they don't give you anything particularly helpful from it, and you don't really engage, and then you can just ignore them and move on and speak to someone else. I tried to rumble through the first few months, just keeping it to myself, and chances are it will boil over at some point. So just try and find someone early on that you can talk to, and just make use of the resources as well. Tommy's website is unbelievably good. Just get on there and read. But then also in the same vein, don't read too much if you can avoid it. There's also, once you get down the rabbit hole, especially when you end up on a load of American websites, that are mostly just trying to sell you something, right? Just there's also a danger of over researching. But if you can find
Mm.
yourself a good, sensible resource like Tommy's or NHS, wherever it might be, yeah, try and get, get some knowledge of the process
Oops.
early. And yeah, don't get completely sucked into the rabbit hole. Although that's easier said than done. When you can't sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're on some crazy website talking about things, yeah, it can get a bit intensive time stuff.
It's not a competition. It's something we've said a few times. Your problem is just as valid as someone else's, just because it doesn't seem as big, or they've had it worse, as you say. I think that's something we've grappled with a bit as well over the years. So, yeah, no, very sound advice. What advice would you give to someone who gets asked by their best mate to sign up to run the London Marathon with having not done a huge amount of running before?
So yeah, so talking about things that aren't a competition, what very much is a competition is the London Marathon. And yeah, I would strongly recommend resisting that as early as possible. And that's probably an example of where perhaps it isn't better to talk to people,
Yeah.
because you might get roped into something. But no, I like seriously flattered to be asked. We'll see whether you regret asking me in 4 or 5 days. But no, super excited to be part of the project as a whole.
I don't think I'll regret asking you, but it's whether you'll regret saying yes. Perhaps I'll ask you that question every 4 miles as we go through. But what's your running experience prior to this? Are you a runner, Charlie?
I'm not sure I would describe myself as a runner. I since I met Alice, I have occasionally gone on runs. I did a reasonable amount of running during COVID, so did a few. I think I did my first half marathon a couple of weeks before COVID hit, and enjoyed it enough that that I carried on running, and I've since done quite a few half marathons. Done quite a lot less running since we had Dorothy, but bits and bobs. So no, like, I'm not sure I would describe myself as naturally sporty, um, but I've gone through sporty phases of my life. So I've previously sort of gone through phases where I do quite a lot of cycling. You and I have done a bit of cycling together. I went through a couple of years of rowing, which is not something that you can sort of do half-heartedly.
Yeah.
And then yeah, in the later years, more running just because of the ease of being able to slap some shoes on and go for a run. But I'm certainly not a long distance runner. I'm not,
Until now.
yeah, not a marathon runner.
Well, I would have classified myself very much in the same boat as you until not that long ago. So I think anything anything is possible. But how's training been? How have you found it? Obviously you mentioned that you've done a few halves. Is it just the same again?
No, no, very much not. No, so training's been all right. So I sort of started properly getting back into running about this time last year and built up to basically had to go from 0 to a half again and sort of relearn that bit. So I did a half
Mm.
last summer and then it just kept everything ticking over.
And then
Yeah, and then once it was born, so obviously I had to take up running to be as helpful as possible.
yeah,
I've done that classic thing of taking up marathon running. It's when a child is born.
I've steered into that skid a little bit more than most.
You've absolutely nailed that one. Then sort of started properly marathon training in December, and it's gone reasonably well. There are a few hiccups. Very touch wood, very lucky that I haven't picked up any real injuries. But I've had a few, um, the sickness bugs that are fairly typical from having young children. I picked up a few of those, which can knock you out for a week or so. So I wouldn't say that the training run's been perfect, but it's happened. And I did the 32-kilometer, 20-mile long run last about a week and a half ago, and that was okay. But I am slightly nervous about the fact that I've got to do that again, plus another 10 kilometers. But a lot of faith is going into this crowd. So
On a selfish level, I am now obviously at a point where I'm reasonably comfortable with the distance. So I'm absolutely buzzing for Sunday. I think have you been to watch before?
no, never. No.
I remember I went to watch 2-3 years ago and ended up just sitting on this curb for like 2 hours, just clapping constantly and shouting people's names from their bibs, which was, and that was incredible from my perspective. So to be on the receiving end of that and just have people shouting your name for what are we saying, 4.5 hours
Yeah, I think so.
is well, it must be quite the ego boost, if nothing else. It's one of those bucket list days out, I think. So that's the mindset, I think. And if we can get around, we'll get around. Yeah, we survived my stag do, so I think we can survive the London Marathon. I think, or survive the drive home from my stag do.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that is a story for a very different podcast. But no, I think it's going to be a fantastic day out. We'll get you around. I've got lots of support, so thank you in advance to everyone that's coming down to watch and cheer us on. And if you're out in London on Sunday and spot two large non-runner looking types in pink t-shirts stumbling past at mile 20 something, then give us a big cheer. It'd be great to hear all the shouts. So yeah, thanks so much, Charlie, for being on and for being involved from fairly early on in the challenge and for sharing your story. And yeah, can't wait for Sunday.
Thanks, Ollie. See you on Sunday.
See you there. Bye.